After 20 years on death row, Stephen Wayne Anderson faced his final moments. He was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison in California. It was just past midnight on January 28, 2002. The prison was quiet, its cold concrete corridors carrying the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Anderson sat upright in his cell, hours away from his end. The court had spoken. So had the state. He would go by lethal injection. There would be no more appeals. No last-minute reprieves. Not this time. To the public, Anderson wasn't just another inmate. He was a man who had taken life without hesitation, again and again. And while he had expressed some regret in his final years, Anderson also made one thing chillingly clear. In his own words, "I was born and trained to take lives. I always wanted to take lives." It wasn't just a confession. It was a declaration, a glimpse into the mind of someone who had not only embraced aggression but lived by it. The system had given him chance after chance, but eventually, those chances ran out. His lawyers tried to argue that his brutal childhood had shaped the man he became. But by then, the damage was done. The courts didn't want to hear it. Not after the trail he had left behind. Not after the headlines. Not after the blood. So, what exactly had Stephen Wayne Anderson done? What made the justice system stop listening, stop forgiving? To answer that, we have to go back to the beginning, to his childhood, to the first time he took a life, and to the path that led him to death row. Stephen Wayne Anderson was born on July 8, 1953. From the very beginning, his life was marked by pain. He was the eldest of two boys, born into a home where love didn't live. His father was a drinker, a harsh, unpredictable one. He beat the boys. He beat their mother too. The cruelty didn't stop there. Anderson's mother mirrored the mistreatment, cold, harsh, and unforgiving. The cycle of aggression didn't break. It intensified. By the time Anderson was 14, his mother had had enough. She kicked both boys out, throwing them into the world without a second thought. No money. No guidance. No place to go. Stephen and his brother drifted, living with relatives, sleeping where they could. But something had shifted in Stephen. A quiet rage, a deep hunger to survive in a world that had no use for him. At first, he broke into houses for food, clothes, and something warm to wear. But soon it became something more, the rush, the control, the sense of power he had never known as a child. Stephen Wayne Anderson's descent into darkness wasn't sudden. It unfolded slowly, aggressively over a decade, but by the end of it, there was no mistaking the man he had become. His first serious run-in with the law came in 1971. At 18 years old, he broke into a school in Farmington, New Mexico. What began as a burglary quickly escalated. When officers responded, Anderson didn't run. He confronted them, threatened them. Convicted of burglary, he was sentenced to 1 to 5 years. But prison didn't reform him. It hardened him. By 1975, even after parole, he was still incarcerated, this time serving 10 to 50 years for a string of aggravated burglaries. Transferred to Utah State Prison, Anderson's violence escalated. On August 24, 1977, he took the life of fellow inmate Blundell, one of the earliest signs that he was capable of killing without remorse. Soon after, he assaulted another prisoner, then a correctional officer. The pattern of destruction went on, with Anderson at the center of it. 2 years later, on November 24, 1979, he escaped. Investigators believe he began working for drug traffickers and was implicated in yet another killing. He vanished into the eastern mountains of Salt Lake County. Details still murky but confirmed by multiple law enforcement sources. But the most brutal act, the one that would eventually send Anderson to row, was yet to come. May 26, 1980. Bloomington, California. Anderson, now 26 years old, broke into the home of Elizabeth Lyman, an 81-year-old retired piano teacher who lived alone. Just past midnight, Anderson crept around the house. He cut her phone line, removed a glass pane from her French doors, and stepped inside with a .45 caliber handgun. He searched the rooms, one by one, until he reached her bedroom. Elizabeth woke up. She screamed. Anderson raised the gun and fired at close range, hitting her in the face. The bullet hollow point took her life instantly. She fell back onto the bed. Anderson calmly pulled the blanket over her body, collected the shell casing, and began to search the house. He took $112. Then, in a disturbing act that would later haunt jurors and investigators, Anderson went into her kitchen. He made himself a meal in her kitchen. He sat at her table. He ate, no urgency, no guilt. As Stephen Wayne Anderson sat in Elizabeth Lyman's kitchen, the scent of noodles and fried egg filled the quiet house. He had made the meal himself, calmly, methodically, just moments after taking the life of an elderly woman. With the gun still nearby and the body of his victim tucked beneath a blanket in the next room, Anderson sat down and ate as if nothing had happened. Outside, deputies had already surrounded the home. A neighbor had seen an unusual movement and called the police. Officers approached with caution, unsure what they'd find. Through the window, they saw him sitting in Lyman's living room, relaxed, legs crossed. He wasn't hiding or fleeing. He looked like a man who had no intention of running. They entered the home with weapons drawn. Anderson didn't fight. He didn't speak. He was arrested on the spot, initially for burglary. It wasn't until deputies searched the rest of the house that they made the grim discovery. Elizabeth Lyman, 81 years old, was fired in the face, lying motionless beneath a blanket in her bedroom. The charges changed immediately. First-degree homicide. When they searched him, Anderson had just over $100 on his person. Cash was stolen from the very woman he had ended the life of. Under questioning, he didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He told investigators exactly what happened. There was no remorse in his voice, just facts. 2 days after his arrest, a court-appointed psychiatrist was brought in to evaluate him. The findings were clear. Anderson was sane. He was sober. And he knew exactly what he was doing when he pulled the trigger that night. He was deemed competent to stand trial. At trial, prosecutors presented his recorded confession of carrying out 6 targeted hits in Las Vegas, incidents that happened before the Lyman case. They also presented a record of wrongdoing inside and outside prison, harassment toward other inmates, repeated incidents involving correctional officers, and a pattern of calculated brutality. Prosecutors told the court he was too dangerous to ever be released. Anderson fought back. He argued that his state-appointed lawyer was incompetent, even racist toward clients, and had a troubling record in capital cases. But the courts were unmoved. A San Bernardino County jury found him guilty of first-degree homicide. Because the incident happened during a burglary, they recommended the highest penalty. The judge agreed. There were delays, procedural errors. A second trial had to be held to determine whether the life taken was premeditated under California law, but the outcome didn't change. On July 24, 1981, Stephen Wayne Anderson was formally sentenced to face the highest penalty, death by lethal injection. Stephen reappealed to Governor Gray Davis, who responded with a public statement. He said he had personally reviewed the evidence and had no doubt about Anderson's guilt. And then he went further. There is no dispute, Davis said, that Mr. Anderson, with an IQ of 136, is an extremely intelligent man. But his intelligence, ironically, makes the brutality and indifference of his acts all the more reprehensible. There would be no clemency, no last-minute reprieve, no stay. After his conviction, Stephen Wayne Anderson was transferred to San Quentin State Prison and placed on a row. In the 20 years he'd spent on row, Anderson had tried to rebuild himself. He became known across prison walls for something unexpected: his writing, poems about loss, confinement, time. He'd earned awards published in literary journals. People outside of prison began to know his name, not for what he did, but for what he wrote. And yet, no matter how far his words reached, they never softened the sentence that hovered above him. The state still saw the man who had taken the life of an elderly woman in her own home. Not the writer, not the poet, just the man who took a life. They argued it was all performance, pointing to continued incidents of harassment and violence inside prison. Activists and writers fought for his clemency, but Governor Davis's stance on capital punishment was unshakable. The appeals failed. January 28, 2002. 9 p.m. Anderson sat in his cell under the buzz of the fluorescent light. No stays were coming. No appeals left to file. Outside San Quentin, as the night deepened and his final hour drew near, nearly 200 people stood gathered outside the prison gates. It was one of the largest execution night gatherings the prison had seen in years. The air was near freezing. Still, they came wrapped in blankets, holding candles. Some prayed, some wept. But all came for the same reason. They weren't there to protest guilt or innocence. They were there to protest against the sentence. Among them was Lyle Grosjean, an Episcopal priest from Santa Cruz. He'd just completed a 25-mile walk from San Francisco to San Quentin, joined by 14 others, all taking a peaceful stand. "We walk to show our commitment," Grosjean said. "We're against the sentence. Punishment isn't the answer, compassion is. We're unequivocally opposed in all cases, guilty or innocent." 10 p.m. A guard opened the door and stepped into the cell. Anderson was asked what he wanted for his last meal. He paused for a moment, then spoke softly. He chose grilled cheese sandwiches, peach pie, and chocolate ice cream. Simple, almost childlike comfort food. A few minutes later, the tray arrived. Anderson sat on the edge of his cot, eating slowly. 11:45 p.m., prison officials returned. It was time to escort him to the chamber. Anderson stood on his own. No resistance. He was led down the corridor, the last walk, they called it. No family came to witness. No relatives of Elizabeth Lyman. Only staff, state witnesses, and his attorney, Margot Riccone. He lay down on the gurney, resting his head against the stiff pillow. Straps were fastened over his wrists, ankles, and chest. And 4 was inserted into his arm. When asked if he had any last words, Anderson stayed silent, but he turned toward the viewing window. On the other side of the glass stood Margot Riccone, his public defender, the one person who had stood by him for years. She mouthed 3 words to him. "I love you." He blinked, took a breath, and mouthed back, "Thank you." 12:17 a.m. The lethal chemicals flowed. His body tensed, then stilled. At 12:30 a.m., Stephen Wayne Anderson was pronounced dead at age 48. In one of his final letters, he wrote, "It's too bad I'm only learning the meaning of life just as I'm about to lose it." But for the state of California, poetry and reflection couldn't erase what happened in 1980. In the end, he was remembered not for the words he left behind, but for the life he took. If you want to uncover more true crime stories like this one, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Don't miss a single case.